There's a myth in the business world that if you want to be more innovative, you should hire creative people and then just leave them alone. While some of you probably would like to be left alone more at work, the reality is that taking the creatives and putting them off in the corner doesn't consistently lead to innovative results. Ed Catmull is the founder and CEO of Pixar, the film company that created the Toy Story trilogy, Up, and many other creative films. And Ed says, you can take a good idea and give it to a mediocre team, and they will screw it up. But if you take a mediocre idea and you give it to a brilliant team, they will either fix it or throw it out and come up with something better. In the work that I've done with teams, I've seen what Ed is talking about. And I've found that in addition to that, you can teach teams how to be more creative, even mediocre ones. I've worked with hundreds of teams, helping them become more creative. But how do you develop a brilliant creative team? That was the question that I was asking in my PhD research. And what I discovered, I want to share with you today so that you can learn how to build a more creative team. First, I want to share with you a story, an experience I had long ago at the beginning of my career. I was working at a university. I was the director or assistant director of an outdoor leadership program. And I was on a team of about 12 staff, and like most staff, we had regular team meetings. And one day at one of our team meetings, I remember we were in the boardroom of the student union with one of the big oval tables and those nice comfy wheelie chairs. And in the middle of the meeting, another colleague of mine says, you know, that she's having this problem and she wanted to know if we would be willing to brainstorm for a bit and help her come up with some ideas. Well, I heard the word brainstorm and I just sat up a bit taller. I was 26, full of ideas, and I was excited. So she explains the situation and we start sharing some ideas, and it seemed like things were going well. Until about the fourth idea. Another colleague jumps in. I'll call him Phil. Not his real name. Phil was about 20 years older than me. He had been in his job for about 20 years, and I would describe him as being a bit jaded. After sharing this fourth idea, Phil jumps in and says, oh no, we did that in 1985 and it was a complete disaster. We're not doing that. And I just bust out laughing. I thought for sure he was joking. And then I saw the look on his face and realized, oh, he's serious. And in my head, I'm thinking, what? 1985? That was like almost 2 decades ago. Maybe the context has changed a bit since then, or maybe we can take what we learned then and apply it to this situation. But I didn't say anything out loud. And my colleague with the problem politely said, are there any more ideas? Well, you know what happened next. No one said anything. And now my poor colleague has 3 ideas. That's barely a grocery list, much less a brainstorming session. Now, I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you have been a part of a lousy brainstorming session? Oh my gosh, almost everybody. Think about who was the Phil in your case. So I left that meeting feeling frustrated with Phil. And then for the next 15 years, I dove in to study creativity in teams, to figure out what can make teams more creative. And what I realized is the mistake that day wasn't Phil's, but mine. I could have just as easily said, hey, Phil, tell us what happened in 1985. Why didn't it work? Or I could have said, Phil, you make a great point. Could you hold off on the judgment and let's generate some more ideas before we start evaluating them? I could have easily spoken up and shifted the conversation, but I didn't. Think about that situation you were in. What might you have done to help your team be more creative? Biologist Edward Wilson says that creativity is our innate quest for originality. It's all about possibility and then bringing that possibility to life. And as humans, it's in our DNA. It's what we do. We can't help ourselves. I mean, look around this room. People created all of this. The building, this round red rug, the speakers, the lights, this fancy mic I'm wearing, even the TED concept. People made this up. It's what we do. We create, we innovate. It's what sets us apart from every other species on the planet. We're also a collaborative species. And so it's no accident that the most innovative organizations are also the ones who are intentionally developing creativity in their teams. When teams are able to reach this level of creative synergy, they can be more creative than each team member could be individually. But teams are complex. You've seen it. Team members can sabotage ideas, they can compete amongst themselves, or they just don't care. But if your organization is to be innovative, you have to pay attention to creativity. Otherwise, you run the risk of being Blockbuster, Atari, Radio Shack, Sears, and countless other businesses who have been left behind for staying the same. So how do you develop creative teams? In my PhD study, I did a research study and I surveyed hundreds of team members, and then I went in depth with 3 teams. And what I found is that there's 3 elements that teams need if they want to be creative together. I'm going to share those with you. The first is teams need to have a strong sense of team purpose. Team purpose meaning, what are we doing together? Why do we meet on a regular basis? And there needs to be a connection to that purpose. We need to care about that purpose. We need to know why it matters. But that purpose can't be too narrow. It needs to be broad enough that there's some flexibility and autonomy in there. That's the creativity piece, right? In 1995, there was an automotive firm on the eastern US that was really struggling. They had gone from 5,000 employees to 1,500 employees. They were having severe labor management disputes. They had had 3 bomb threats at their facility and even a murder-suicide attempt. Things were grim. And the organization's management and labor unions got together and they looked at what was going on and realized they needed to create a culture that was more cooperative, more team-focused. So they put together 71 teams to look at both product and process innovations. And they invited an expert to come in and teach these teams how to be creative together and how to work well together. And then they invited 2 researchers to come in, Craig Pierce and Michael Ensley, and gave them the opportunity to look at these teams over a period of 20 months to see what was it about the most innovative teams, what were the commonalities amongst those teams. And what the researchers found was that the biggest factor was their sense of team purpose. And that team purpose drove innovation, but then as they were more innovative, they further clarified their purpose, which further drove innovation. And they got into this cycle, this positive loop. Now, when I think about my team with Phil, I don't ever remember us talking about our team purpose. And I think, wow, maybe if we'd had some conversations about that, it would have helped us be more focused and helped us be more innovative. So the first thing is a team needs to have a clear purpose in order to be creative together. The second piece is that teams need to have this strong sense of team dynamics. Team dynamics is simply how we interact with each other, the behaviors amongst the team members, the relationships. Having good communication is an example of a team dynamic. Good communication is probably obvious that teams need that. But the other thing teams need is they need to have a level of psychological safety. And psychological safety is where, as a team member, I can put an idea out on the table and I know that I'm not going to be attacked. That I can be myself. I can bring my whole self to my team. It's going to be all right. But on the flip side, teams also need to be able to engage in a level of creative abrasion. And creative abrasion is where we can disagree around ideas and concepts, but we're not disagreeing because of our personalities or our identities. So when I think about my team with Phil was trying to engage in some creative abrasion, but we didn't have the level of psychological safety where it actually worked. And so when that fourth idea was thrown out and it got shot down, we all just shut down. But if your team can develop the higher level of psychological safety and understand how to have conflict together, you'll actually be more creative. So the third element that I discovered in my studies was that teams need to have a creative process. And that just simply means, how are we working together? How are we being creative together? What's our methodology, our approach? When I think about my team with Phil, we never talked about a process. My colleague wanted to brainstorm, so we just started verbally throwing out ideas. Phil jumps in and criticizes them. And we never talked about how we were going to do this. So when Phil jumped in and criticized that idea, he's actually coming from a place of good intention. He means well. He wanted to make sure that we didn't make the same mistake that we made back in 1985. But the problem was, we can't engage in both generating ideas and evaluating ideas at the same time. Those are two different types of thinking for our brain, and so we need to separate those out. And having a creative process can help you separate those types of thinking out and help your team be more creative together. So when your team has a clear shared purpose, strong team dynamics, and they know and use a creative process, they will be more creative together. But there's one more piece that encircles all of this, and that is that teams need to want to be creative. They need to actually be willing to put the work into it. It doesn't happen by accident. Putting the team off in the corner and hoping something emerges, not helpful. Essentially, if teams want to be creative, they have to be deliberate. So there's more to the story about Phil. About 6 months after that failed brainstorming attempt, Phil invited all of us over to his house for an end-of-the-year potluck. Had a chance to meet his wife and his 10-year-old son, and I found out that Phil was really into the community theater, and he played guitar. And I listened to his son talk about different experiences they'd had together. I saw this completely different side of Phil. I saw his creativity. And I realized that something was happening when he walked through that door to go to work every day that was stripping away his creativity. And I realized the same thing was happening for all of us. And I thought, wow, what if we really could be fully creative together? How might we serve the students at the university better? So you might be wondering, okay, now what? What do I do? The first thing, start with yourself. Don't make the same mistake I did and try to point blame to your team members. What can you do? Every team member has power and influence in the team. That's why you're there. On that particular day, our team gave Phil a lot of power. But I didn't speak up and I didn't say anything, and I could have. I could have made a difference by saying something. We might have helped solve my colleague's problem, and more importantly, we might have been able to be more creative in the long run. So I want you to think about a team that you're a part of. It might be a project team at work. Maybe you're CEO and you have an executive team. Maybe there's a committee or a board you're on. Maybe you're a volunteer in your community. Maybe it's your family. Think about that team. I want to give you a moment to picture that team in your mind. What difference would it make if you could be more creative together and produce innovative results? How would it change your family, your community, the company you work with? What difference would that make? Creativity is in our DNA. I believe that we have a moral responsibility to bring that creativity out of ourselves and foster that within our teams and within our organizations. So you have that team image in your mind. I'm going to ask you 3 questions related to these 3 elements. The first was team purpose. Sometimes what happens for teams is different team members have different perspectives of what the purpose is. So my question for you is, when can you have a conversation with your team to clarify your team purpose? The second was team dynamics. Think about how you all behave together in your interactions. What might be one thing you could change? Where would you start if you wanted to change those dynamics? The third was your creative process. Sometimes what happens in teams is that there's not intentionality around the process, and it's just a default behavior. For instance, the way you start your team meeting or how you brainstorm. So the question is, what can you do to adjust your team process that might help your team be more creative? If you want to have a deliberate creative team, you need to be sure you have a clear shared purpose, strong team dynamics, and you know and use a creative process. If you do, you have the potential to have a big impact on the community you live in, with your family, and maybe even the world. Don't forget, if you want to be creative, be deliberate. Thank you.